Enter. The single word hung in the air, heavy and resonant, vibrating through the polished mahogany doors and straight into Ilara's chest. It wasn't just a command, it was a physical presence, rich and dark, with an undercurrent of something ancient and utterly controlled. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. He gave Ilara a final, desperate look that screamed good luck, and pushed the heavy doors open. Ilara stepped across the threshold, her chin held high, her posture a masterclass in corporate armor. She didn't flinch at the dim lighting or the oppressive silence of the room. She was here to work, and she would not be intimidated by a billionaire who preferred to lurk in the shadows. Kalen Thorne was not a ghost. He was a force of nature contained within a bespoke charcoal gray suit. He sat at the head of a long, dark wood table, his broad shoulders stretching the fine fabric of his jacket. His dark hair was styled with deliberate casualness, but it was his face that commanded the room. It was carved from sharp, unforgiving angles, a strong jaw, a straight nose, and cheekbones that could cut glass. But it was his eyes that arrested her completely. They were dark, impossibly deep, and currently fixed on her with an intensity that felt less like a look and more like a physical touch. As Ilara stepped fully into the room, the air between them seemed to warp. A sudden, sharp spike of heat flared at the base of her throat, right over her collarbone. It was a strange, localized burn, like a drop of molten wax, accompanied by a sudden, overwhelming rush of adrenaline that made her breath hitch. Kalen Thorne's gaze dropped, just for a fraction of a second, to the exact spot on her collarbone where the heat was pulsing, his jaw clenched, a muscle ticking violently beneath the skin. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant, muffled rumble of thunder and the sudden, frantic pounding of Ilara's own heart. "Ms. Vance," Kalen said. His voice was a low, smooth baritone that seemed to wrap around her, warm and dangerously inviting. "Julian tells me you are the architect who believes my building is suffocating." Ilara forced her breathing to steady. She stepped forward, placing her portfolio on the edge of the table, maintaining a safe, professional distance. "I believe the building is trying to breathe, Mr. Thorne. My job is to give it the lungs to do so without compromising your aesthetic vision or your budget." A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of his mouth. It didn't reach his eyes. His eyes remained locked on her, calculating, assessing. Lungs, an interesting choice of words for a structure made of steel, glass, and concrete. "Architecture is biology, Mr. Thorne," Ilara replied, her voice crisp, falling into the familiar, comforting rhythm of her expertise. "A building has a circulatory system in its HVAC, a skeletal structure in its load-bearing walls, and a nervous system in its electrical grid. If you treat it like a static object, it fails. If you treat it like a living organism, it thrives." Kalen leaned back in his leather chair, the movement fluid and predatory. He steepled his fingers, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "And you believe you can make this organism thrive, Ms. Vance?" "The last 3 firms I hired looked at the Obsidian Tower and saw a trophy. They designed monuments to their own egos. I have no use for egos. I require functionality. I require resilience." "Then you've hired the right person," Ilara said, meeting his gaze without blinking. "I don't design trophies. I design fortresses that happen to be beautiful." The silence that followed was thick, charged with a strange, static electricity. Julian shifted uncomfortably near the door, clearly terrified that Ilara's boldness had just cost her the contract. Instead, Kalen slowly stood up. He was taller than she had anticipated. Much taller. As he rose, he seemed to fill the room, his presence suddenly overwhelming, pressing against her senses. The scent of ozone and wood smoke intensified, wrapping around her like a heavy, intoxicating blanket. "Prove it," he said softly. Ilara blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You have 20 minutes of pitch time in a boardroom with a hologram," Kalen said, walking around the edge of the table. His movements were eerily silent for a man of his size. Anyone can talk a good game over a glowing projection. "I want to see the site. I want to see how you interact with the space you claim to understand so intimately." Julian let out a small, strangled noise. "Sir, the lower levels are still an active construction zone. The safety protocols are adequate." Julian, Kalen interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He didn't even look at his project manager. His focus remained entirely unnervingly on Ilara. Unless Ms. Vance is only comfortable designing from the safety of a climate-controlled office? Ilara's spine straightened. A challenge. She knew how to handle a challenge. "I prefer the dirt to the boardroom, Mr. Thorne," she said smoothly. "Lead the way." The descent to the lower levels of the obsidian tower was a jarring transition. They left the plush, silent luxury of the executive floors and took a service elevator down to the sublevels, where the building was still a raw skeletal beast. The air down here was cooler, smelling of wet concrete, cured epoxy, and the sharp tang of welding ozone. Exposed steel beams crisscrossed the ceiling like the ribs of a leviathan. The ambient lighting was harsh, casting long, dramatic shadows across the unfinished floors. Ilara felt a surge of pure, unadulterated joy. This was her domain. This was where the magic happened, long before the marble was polished and the art was hung. She pulled a rolled set of blueprints from her portfolio, snapping them open with a crisp crack. "We're currently on sub-level 2, she began, her voice taking on an authoritative, guiding cadence. She pointed to a massive, reinforced concrete pillar. "This is the primary load-bearing core for the geothermal exchange system I mentioned upstairs. The previous engineers wanted to route the thermal pipes through the eastern wing. I had it moved here, to the center." Kalen walked beside her, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. He wasn't looking at the pillar, he was looking at her. "Why the center?" he asked. His voice was quieter down here, stripped of the boardroom's echo, making it sound dangerously intimate. "Because the Earth's thermal gradient is most stable at the building's geometric center," Ilara explained, tracing a line on the blueprint with a manicured finger. "By centralizing the exchange, we reduce the length of the primary conduits by 30%. It saves on material costs, reduces the risk of pressure leaks, and creates a natural radiant heating baseline for the entire tower. It's efficient, it's elegant." She looked up to gauge his reaction. He was standing entirely too close. In the confined space of the unfinished corridor, the distance between them had shrunk to mere inches. Ilara could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the chill of the concrete around them. She could see the fine, dark stubble along his jawline, the impossible depth of his dark eyes. And she could smell him. Beneath the ozone and wood smoke, there was something else. Something rich and dark, like aged bourbon and rain-soaked earth. It was a scent that triggered a bizarre primal instinct in the back of her mind, a sudden, irrational urge to step closer, to lean into that warmth. Ilara mentally shook her head, blaming the exhaustion of the past 48 hours and the stress of the pitch. "Focus, Vance. He's the client. He's the enemy." "It sounds adequate," Kalen murmured. Ilara's eyes narrowed. "Adequate? It will save your company $2 million in the first 5 years of operation alone." "I didn't say it wasn't profitable, Ms. Vance. I said it was adequate." He took a half-step closer, invading her personal space with a casual arrogance that made her breath catch. "But architecture is not just about mathematics and profit margins. It is about feeling. When a person walks into this tower, what do you want them to feel?" Ilara held her ground, refusing to be backed up. She tilted her chin up, meeting his gaze defiantly. "I want them to feel grounded. I want them to feel the weight and the permanence of the structure, but also the lightness of the space. I want them to feel safe but awed." "Safe," Kalen repeated. The word rolled off his tongue like a foreign concept, heavy with skepticism. "Safety is the foundation of luxury," she countered. "You can't enjoy the view from the 70th floor if you're subconsciously worried the glass will shatter." Kalen's gaze dropped again. This time, it wasn't to her collarbone, it was to her hands, which were gripping the edges of the blueprint. "Show me," he said. "Show you what?" "The integration point. The central core. You said it yourself. Show me where the magic happens." Ilara hesitated for a fraction of a second. The request was unusual. CEOs didn't typically want to crawl around in the dust and rebar of a sub-basement, but she wasn't about to back down. "Follow me," she said. She turned and led him deeper into the unfinished corridor, toward a heavy, temporary steel door that had been propped open. Beyond it lay the central mechanical shaft, a vast, cylindrical space that plunged down into the earth and stretched up toward the sky. It was dark, illuminated only by a few hanging work lights. The air here was warmer, humming with the latent energy of the building's dormant systems. Ilara walked to the edge of the safety railing, looking down into the abyss of the shaft. "This is it," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "The heart of the obsidian tower. From here, the geothermal loops will extend 300 feet into the bedrock." She unrolled the blueprint further, needing to point out a specific detail on the schematic. "If you look right here, at the junction of the primary intake valve," she reached out with her right hand to point at the paper. At the exact same moment, Kalen reached out with his left hand, intending to steady the rolling edge of the blueprint that was catching a draft from the shaft. Their hands brushed. It wasn't a gentle graze, it was a collision. The moment his skin made contact with hers, the world violently ceased to exist. A shockwave of pure, blinding energy erupted from the point of contact, tearing through Ilara's nervous system like a lightning strike. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelmingly intense, a sudden, explosive rush of heat that flooded her veins, stealing the breath from her lungs and making her knees buckle. A sharp, searing burn flared at the base of her throat, right over her collarbone. It felt as though someone had pressed a branding iron to her skin. Ilara gasped, a small, involuntary sound, and instinctively tried to pull her hand away. But Kalen didn't let go. For a terrifying, exhilarating second, his fingers closed around her wrist. His grip was iron-hard, scorching hot. Ilara looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and met his eyes. His pupils had blown wide, swallowing the dark iris until his eyes were almost entirely black. His chest was heaving. His nostrils flared as he drew in a sharp, ragged breath. The controlled, icy billionaire was gone. In his place was something raw, primal, and utterly terrifying. He was staring at her neck. Ilara followed his gaze, looking down at her own collarbone. Through the thin, white silk of her blouse, she could see a faint, pulsing luminescence. It looked like a tiny, ember-like sigil, glowing with a soft, fiery orange light just beneath her skin, right where the burning sensation was concentrated. What the hell? Before she could process the impossible sight, before she could even form a coherent thought, Kalen violently recoiled. He snatched his hand back as if he had touched a live wire, stumbling a full step backward. The sudden absence of his heat left Ilara shivering, the cold air of the basement rushing in to fill the void he left behind. Kalen's face had gone completely pale. His jaw locked so tight she thought his teeth might shatter. He stared at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The air around him seemed to vibrate with a suppressed, terrifying energy. "Mr. Thorne?" Ilara asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to control it. She clutched the blueprint to her chest, a sudden, irrational urge to protect herself washing over her. "Are you all right?" He didn't answer immediately. He closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing second, taking a deep, shuddering breath. When he opened them again, the primal darkness was gone, locked away behind a wall of impenetrable glacial ice. The transformation was so sudden, so absolute, that Ilara felt a spike of genuine unease. "I am fine," Kalen said. His voice was devoid of all warmth. It was flat, cold, and utterly dismissive. He turned his back to her, facing the dark expanse of the mechanical shaft. "The tour is over." Ilara blinked, stunned by the abrupt dismissal. "But we haven't discussed the secondary ventilation." "I said the tour is over, Ms. Vance," he interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut. He didn't look at her. "Return to the executive floor. Julian will escort you out." He began walking away, his long strides eating up the distance between them and the exit. Ilara stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She looked down at her hand, the one he had touched. It was still tingling, a phantom warmth lingering on her skin. She reached up and touched her collarbone. The skin was hot to the touch, but when she pulled the fabric of her blouse aside to look, there was nothing there. No burn, no mark, just her own pale skin. A trick of the light, she told herself firmly, her rational mind scrambling for a logical explanation. A reflection from the work lamp. And the shock, it was just static electricity. A buildup of charge in this dry, concrete environment. But even as she formed the thought, she knew it was a lie. Static electricity didn't make her heart race like a runaway train. Static electricity didn't make her feel a sudden, devastating sense of loss when he pulled away. She watched Kalen's retreating back, the broad, imposing silhouette of a man who had just fled the room as if she were a threat. "Fine," Ilara thought, a spark of defiance igniting in her chest, burning away the confusion. "If he wants to play games, I can play games." She rolled up the blueprint with a sharp, decisive snap, tucked it under her arm, and followed him out of the dark, leaving the phantom heat at her collarbone pulsing like a second heartbeat.